Hey folks, it's Michael with the Reason RX podcast. 16 May 2021. Hope you are doing well. We're still in the COVID crisis, COVID quarantine thing going on. All kinds of cultural stuff going on all the time, always. Never leave it to, how should I put it? Some people will always find an opportunity to do screwy things no matter what. So they're always out there, unfortunately. But today, we're going to be talking about language, culture, logic, the role of education, reason, the truth in education. So again, we'll start with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Same one as last time. It's relevant this time too. This is from his article, The Purpose of Education, published in 1947 in the Morehouse College newspaper, the newspaper called The Maroon Tiger. So, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in 1947, quote, "Education must also train one for quick, resolute, and effective thinking. To think incisively and to think for one's own self is very difficult. We are prone to let our mental life become invaded by legions of half-truths, prejudices, and propaganda. At this point, I often wonder whether or not education is fulfilling its purpose. A great majority of the so-called educated people do not think logically and scientifically. Even the press, the classroom, the platform, and the pulpit, in many instances, do not give us objective and unbiased truths. To save man from the morass of propaganda, in my opinion, is one of the chief aims of education. Education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction." And I'll put a link to this in the show notes so you can read it and the whole thing yourself. So today we got some of that going on. And, oh yeah, damn. I'm so used to thinking about Scott being here that I forgot to introduce our guest. It's like, yeah, there's rain and there's sunshine and Scott's here, obviously. Okay, Scott, can you say hi?
Hello.
Scott again.
Good to talk to you.
Okay. So, we got to think about some of that, what's going on, what we're going to do with some schools, because there's always many issues going on in many different ways, up and down the entire conceptual hierarchy and across the broad conceptual range of human thought. Up and down that hierarchy, across that range, there's always things going on with people and in the world. So, one thing we have nowadays are different ideas about what should happen in schools and how schools should be related to social norms, whether there should be standard forced norms upon everyone, or whether there should be some criticism and free discussion and thought and respect for some positions or not. So there are some articles that have been coming out. Some of these we'll read. And I'll put some links to these in the show notes, of course. So you can look them up as a start. Look at more out there. Here's one. This is entitled "The Miseducation of America's Elites." Subtitle: Affluent parents terrified of running afoul of the new orthodoxy in their children's private schools, organized in secret. It's by Barry Weiss, 9 March 2021, in the City Journal. And he's talking about how these dissidents use fake names and turn off their videos when they meet on clandestine Zoom calls. Sometimes they do it while they're in carpools or soccer practices. Sometimes they come together. It says, quote, they say that they could face profound repercussions if anyone knew they were talking, unquote. Quote, but the situation of late has become too egregious for emails or complaining on conference calls. So on one recent weekend, on a leafy street in West Los Angeles, they gathered in person and invited me to join, unquote. And so, what's happening? What's the deal? Like here, it says, quote, for most parents, the demonization of capitalism is the least of it. They say that their children tell them they're afraid to speak up in class. Most of all, they worry that the school's new plan to become an anti-racist institution, in quotes, dash, unveiled in this July in a 20-page document, dash, is making their kids fixate on race and attach importance to it in ways that strike them as grotesque, unquote. Here, quote, one person, in regard to one person, the father, quote, he says he doesn't have a problem with the school making greater efforts to redress past wrongs, including by bringing more minority voices into the curriculum. What he has a problem with is a movement that tells his children that America is a bad country and that they bear collective racial guilt. They are making my son feel like a racist because of the pigmentation of his skin, one mother says. Another poses a question to the group. How does focusing a spotlight on race fix how kids talk to one another? Why can't they just all be Wolverines? Unquote. And of course, the Wolverine is their mascot. Okay, and here's, so there's a school called Brearley, Brearley, that is a private all-girls school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in New York City. Tuition $54,000 a year, according to this article I'm looking at, where some of this is going on. Title of the article, One Parent of New York City Indoctrination School Has Had Enough. That's from 17 April 2021. There's also the Brentwood School in Los Angeles, $45,000 a year school, where some of this is going on. So here, quote, a $45,000 a year school in Los Angeles is locked in a struggle with parents as administrators push for a more progressive curriculum, unquote. And here's a letter a dad at Brearley wrote. So, okay. 13 April 2021. Dear fellow Brearley parents, our family recently made the decision not to re-enroll our daughter at Brearley for the 2021-22 school year. She has been at Brearley for 7 years, beginning in kindergarten. In short, we no longer believe that Brearley's administration and board of trustees have any of our children's best interests at heart. Moreover, we no longer have confidence that our daughter will receive the quality of education necessary to further her development into a critically thinking, responsible, enlightened, and civic-minded adult, unquote. Does that remind you of Martin Luther King Jr.? Okay. Quote, I write to you as a fellow parent to share our reasons for leaving the Brearley community, but also to urge you to act before the damage to the school, to its community, and to your own child's education is irreparable, unquote. And what about your child's spirit? Okay. Quote, it cannot be stated strongly enough that Brearley's obsession with race must stop. It should be abundantly clear to any thinking parent that Brearley has completely lost its way. The administration and the Board of Trustees have displayed a cowardly and appalling lack of leadership by appeasing an anti-intellectual, illiberal mob and then allowing the school to be captured by that same mob. What follows are my own personal views on Brearley's anti-racism initiatives, but these are just a handful of the criticisms that I know other parents have expressed. I object to the view that I should be judged by the color of my skin. I cannot tolerate a school that not only judges my daughter by the color of her skin, but encourages and instructs her to prejudice others by theirs, period, unquote. What about Martin Luther King? Didn't he say he dreams of a world in which we are not so judged? What about the content of one's character? Okay, quote, by viewing every element of education, every aspect of history, and every facet of society through the lens of skin color and race, we are desecrating the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and utterly violating the movement for which civil rights leaders believed, fought, and died. I object to the charge of systematic racism in this country and at our school. Systematic racism, properly understood, unquote, and it depends how you define it. It's not a major issue. Doesn't mean that there's not a lot of racism or whatever, but this is his definition of racism. We got to pay attention to definitions and talk to people on their terms accordingly. Okay. So, quote, systematic racism, properly understood, is segregated schools and separate lunch counters. It is the interning of Japanese and the exterminating of Jews. Systematic racism is unequivocally not a small number of isolated incidents over a period of decades. Ask any girl of any race if they have ever experienced insults from friends, have ever felt slighted by teachers, or have ever suffered the occasional injustice from a school at which they've spent up to 13 years of their life, and you are bound to hear grievances, some petty, some not. We have not had systematic racism against blacks in this country since the civil rights reforms of the 1960s, a period of more than 50 years. To state otherwise is a flat-out misrepresentation of our country's history and adds no understanding to any of today's societal issues. If anything, long-standing and widespread policies such as affirmative action point in precisely the opposite direction. I object to a definition of systematic racism, apparently supported by Brearley, that any educational, professional, or societal outcome where blacks are underrepresented is prima facie evidence of the aforementioned systematic racism or of white supremacy and oppression. Facile and unsupported beliefs such as these are the polar opposite to the intellectual and scientific truth for which Brearley claims to stand. Furthermore, I call bull squat on Brearley's oft-stated assertion that the school welcomes and encourages the truly difficult and uncomfortable conversations regarding race and the roots of racial discrepancies. I object to the idea that blacks are unable to succeed in this country without aid from government or from whites. Brearley, by adopting critical race theory, is advocating the abhorrent viewpoint that blacks should forever be regarded as helpless victims and are incapable of success regardless of their skills, talents, or hard work. What Brearley is teaching our children is precisely the true and correct definition of racism. I object to mandatory anti-racism training for parents, especially when presented by the rent-seeking charlatans of Pollyanna. These sessions, in both their content and delivery, are so sophomoric and simplistic, so unsophisticated and inane, that I would be embarrassed if they were taught to Brearley kindergartners. They are an insult to parents and unbecoming of any educational institution, let alone one of Brearley's caliber. And it continues. Should I read the whole thing, Scott, or just sum up?
Sum up, yeah.
Yeah. There's more. I'll link to it so people can read more on their own. Last two paragraphs. Quote. So he's finished his objections. Now his last two paragraphs. Over the past several months, I have personally spoken to many Brearley parents, as well as parents of children at peer institutions. It is abundantly clear that the majority of parents believe that Brearley's anti-racism policies are misguided, divisive, counterproductive, and cancerous. Many believe, as I do, that these policies will ultimately destroy what was until recently a wonderful educational institution. But as I am sure will come as no surprise to you, given the insidious cancel culture that has of late permeated our society, most parents are too fearful to speak up. But speak up you must. There is strength in numbers, and I assure you, the numbers are there. Contact the administration and the Board of Trustees and demand an end to the destructive and anti-intellectual claptrap known as anti-racism. Unquote. Remember, he's talking about a specific thing, not anti-racism in particular. He's using that in a technical way. I think he's made it pretty clear he does not like racism and he's anti-racist. He means this. Maybe he should have put a capital A there. Should have done something to kind of, or put scare quotes around it or something. But, quote, and if changes are not forthcoming, then demand new leadership for the sake of our community, our city, our country, and most of all, our children. Silence is no longer an option. Respectfully, Andrew Gutman, unquote. So, again, I'll put a link to several articles in this letter so you can see what's going on. And if we think, as Martin Luther King said, if we don't get carried away with like hate, emotion, lack of understanding, if we sift and weigh evidence, if we discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction, we see that these people want what's good. They do not want racism. They are anti-racist. They just don't want some of this over-the-top, illogical, dishonest racism disguised as anti-racism. Scott, your thoughts?
On all of that?
In 3 seconds. One sentence.
I'm going to narrow down the question a little
Thanks,
bit.
everybody. Good episode. Bye.
Yeah, I think part of the problem here is when we say anti-racism, everybody, well, the vast majority of human beings are against racism. And so then when we look at if the argument is that anti-racism has to be actively conducted, right, as Ibrahim Kendi and others have argued, then you can't, it's not enough to say I'm not racist. You have to be taking active steps to dismantle racism. Okay, fair enough. What are the things then, the mechanisms that caused these disparate outcomes or these racist policies to be in place? So there are some instances where it's very obvious. Jim Crow laws would be an example, with some of the redlining and contracts for the selling of houses, in which it was literally written in the contract that this house cannot be sold to a black person. Those would be obvious things to take away. So since the 50s, a lot of that kind of stuff has gone away. But the claim is that there's a lot more, and a lot of it's invisible. Fair enough claim. How do we measure it then? Well, the leading way seems to be, and the courts have now accepted this, if there's a disparate impact, meaning one group has gotten a different outcome on, say, a standardized test or anything else, then the default assumption is that's proof of discrimination. And it may well be, but is it one among many factors? Is it the dominant factor? Are there others that are more obvious? That debate is not allowed to happen. It is, in fact, I saw somebody arguing on Facebook about a very complex issue, And the person said, in fact, it was housing, and the prices being offered to white homeowners versus minority homeowners. And the argument was, are you saying that there are other factors than race that should be considered? And of course, when you price a house, it's usually based on comparable houses in that neighborhood more than anything else. So of course there are other factors. Race may be a factor, but you're not allowed to insert other factors, or somehow you're denying that race is a factor.
Yeah. So, yeah, we got to differentiate between what some might call systematic racism. And that's why it's important for people to be more logical, define terms. Otherwise, people are developing hate and go into violence when they shouldn't be. They could actually get along. And they could actually get something done in the culture instead of just attack and destroy. But I think in the one letter by systematic racism, he meant political government. And that, yeah, has pretty much been abolished. There could be some social racism, and that even came up in a movie in the 50s with Gregory Peck called Gentleman's Agreement about prejudice against Jews. So there's more going on. You know, there's other things like that too. I mean, hell, when I was young, having the last name Gold, some people lived down the street from us, and they didn't talk to us for a long time because they thought we were Jewish. And they found out we weren't. And then it was okay. It's like, oh my gosh. You know? But there can be some of that kind of thing going on too. What was addressed, and that's a very good movie. I highly recommend it. Gentleman's Agreement. People watch that. Very, very good movie. The Gregory Peck. I'll put that in the show notes. So you can link to it, find it easier, make sure you remember the name and all that. But that can be some kind of systematic racism, if you look at it that way too, that could be and should be addressed. With the governmental thing, that's got to be dealt with in a different way. Because, yeah, that's like forced. But with some social stuff, that should be more reasoned with.
Well, and that's another, when you mention the governmental, that's another thing that's interesting, in that it is the government that propagated so much of the redlining, the separation of the rail cars in New Orleans, leading to Plessy versus Ferguson, the bus lines in Montgomery, Alabama. No service provider is going to want to discriminate against customers. It's just bad business. And so it takes the power of law to come along and say, yes, you will discriminate on a citywide basis.
Yeah. Or in another sense, there was some kind of racism going on both sides in the 60s and 70s. Bruce Lee had to deal with. You know, you had all this BS about Asians being in films. Thankfully, Bruce Lee came along and helped demolish that. But on the other hand, a lot of the Chinese at the time did not want to teach Americans real martial arts. They didn't want to teach them at all, or just teach them like some cheap, watered-down competition stuff. And Bruce Lee's the one that made it real. And he hated racism. He was very against it. He was like, I'm a human being, you're human beings, that's how we should be. But there's some of that is to be dealt with. And for context, racism has been around the world for millennia. It is not an exclusively American thing. It was not invented here. It's an import. It was brought over from other countries. We suffer. That's one bad thing in human history and human heritage that we got to suffer. There's some good things, of course, obviously, that we get to enjoy. And we get to suffer the joy, so to speak. But there's some bad things we got to suffer from imports. And that's one of them.
Well, and I would argue that it's part of the human condition. And when people say America is a racist country, you can try and have clever comebacks like, does a racist country elect a black president 2 times in a row? That's not going to get any ground made. It'll never be conceded. To me, the better question, which economists always like to ask, if you say, is America a racist country, compared to what? Compared to other countries? Compared to an unknown ideal where everybody, is perfect? If you think racism is bad here, go anywhere else, right? And people who have traveled around the world will find that racism is often open, very open. Here, at least most people.
What do you mean by open?
Is people in America today, if they are racist, generally hide it, right? Because it's not, as they should, right? We want to make it expensive to be racist. Right, that there are social costs and so on. But in other countries, that's not necessarily the case.
And Frederick Douglass, even in the 1800s. If you haven't read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, people out there, please read it. He is like a hero of mine. Frederick Douglass was just an amazing human being. He was a slave when he was younger, escaped, and then worked in the North on eliminating slavery from the United States, supporting freedom. He was a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. But he went to England for a while because he thought it'd be better there with racism. But he came back to the U.S. He knew that while there might be less racism there was less opportunity. The United States was a better place where he wanted to live because he knew it had a better future. How would you put it? Just the potential for a better future was possible in America, but not in England. So let's see. So there are some issues about the systematic racism. You don't have government enforcing it anymore. So some of that's gone, but you still have some of the stuff going on, maybe with and then it's a big deal with a lot of, even on Facebook, some Asians having to face some racism. So it's some different people. And, earlier at the beginning of the United States, heck, there's all kinds of stuff, which even Scottish versus English or Scottish versus German. And who is it, the Scottish or the Irish, who would be the poor class and treated really poorly, treated really bad. Different people, different times, all around the world. Native American Indians would take each other as slaves.
Well, coming back then to modern times, when we talk about disparate impact, if that is the measuring stick, that group X, right, is underrepresented in some field compared to group Y and so on, we get into a couple of interesting situations, which is if we say we want to get more women in engineering, for instance, women are about 5 to 10% of engineers, the rest males. How do we get there?
And then doesn't their voice have
obviously scholarships for females who are interested or something like that. But what if fewer women than men are interested in engineering?
Yeah, I think they should have a say in whether they want to be that way or not. It shouldn't be, we're going to social engineer this stuff. Social engineering has been tried in different countries and it has failed. Look at Soviet Union, Communist China.
Conversely, psychology is almost 3/4 female and 1/4 male. No one's clamoring for, we need to even up those numbers. And so that's the next question then is, what happens when one group gets above their percentage in the population?
Or teachers.
Do we start putting caps on that group and saying, well, we have too many of that kind of people in our university, as Harvard and some of the elite universities seem to be doing against Asians?
And then what's the percentage for teachers? It's pretty high. A lot more females than males.
Yes.
And then who's going to do the enforcing?
Especially in elementary school.
And then who's going to be doing the enforcing? Probably government. Do we really want government social engineering and controlling all those aspects of our lives? Otherwise, really seriously, you got to consider if we want this, who is going to make it happen? And do you want, it's going to be government. They're the only ones that have a monopoly on force, you know? Just like,
Well,
and if people don't believe that, if they think it's greed and money that's fundamental, okay, well, look at communist China or Nazi Germany or fascist Italy. Who was in control in Nazi Germany? The companies or the government? Hands down, the government, obviously. Or in like communist China or Soviet Russia. I mean, hell, they're anti-private corporation capitalism bourgeois. They're all about destroying that. It's clearly government control. What were you going to say?
well, so with the disparate impact, California a few years back had a proposition. It failed, but the proposition was that the university system, the California university system, should graduate each ethnic group at least in the percentage of the proportion of society that they were. So if group X is 10% and they're only graduating 5% of group X, that's proof of discrimination and something has to be done. Now, the underlying thought behind all of this is that only things that are socially constructed affect outcomes. So that we as individuals play within this framework that society has set up and we're powerless to change by ourselves. But somehow if we change the superstructure of society, then we'll all become kind of liberated and so on. Obvious questions then are, what happens if a group graduates in a higher percentage, right? Who's going to manage all those little percentages? And again, if we apply this to anything else, like say the NBA or professional sports of any type, are we really going to racially balance it? Or are there other factors at work?
Mm-hmm. Another perspective to take on that. That's one thing we got to remember. We should learn, we should practice, we should remember in thinking skills, there's different perspectives to take on something. I think Aristotle was the one that identified explicitly that we have the ability to focus. I'm not sure historically in philosophy how much that had been developed before him, but you have the ability to look at things in different ways. So a table can be looked at from the perspective of physics. You don't care anything about it, but its weight, its balance, its dynamics, or from a perspective of chemistry, you can focus on it like that. What is it made of? What are the chemicals in it? How does it interact with heat and cold? Or you can focus on it as an aesthetic object. Color, school of design, shape. Or you can focus on it as a utilitarian object. Same thing here. We need to look at some of this from different perspectives. There's that. One thing I think about, what you said about disparate impact. There's that. So we can look at this from different perspectives, different contexts, develop different depths of thought on it. But with some of the disparate impact stuff, it's purely mathematical, therefore rationalistic and detached from reality. We're lost in math. That's been a failure. Ptolemaic astronomy was a failure as a science because it didn't look at causes. Kepler did some goofy stuff when he tried to be Platonic because he didn't look at causes. Kepler was kind of, not as a person, but as a scientist, kind of schizophrenic. Looked at some things in different ways. In some ways, he could be very rigorous and very committed to the evidence, very Aristotelian. And so he discovered that the planets go in elliptical orbits and discovered his three basic laws of motion. But in some ways, he was really Platonic. And at first he was thinking, Well, at the time, okay, they knew there were 5 planets, so he thought, well, there are 5 platonic solids and there's 5 planets, so each planet must follow one of the platonic solids, and he was trying to get them to fit each other and stuff and change the dimensions. And eventually, he saw it didn't work and it was ludicrous, and he got to the business of doing real science. But some of that stuff is just a total failure. But yeah, when you just look at numbers, it doesn't help. We got to look at causes, just as what Kepler did. He wrote his book, A New Astronomy, based on causes. That was the start of modern science and astronomy and helping us actually do something instead of just mathematical description that's not really scientific. We need to look at, if we're going to address real racism, which I abhor, I object to, any racism of any sort, it's wrong. If we're going to get rid of it, we need to see what the cause is. What is the nature of it? What is the nature of the things involved? What are the causes of racism? Math, statistical stuff does not help. That's taking people's attention away from what really matters, from causes, from the real world, from what's really going on. And you can't do anything about it unless you really know the cause. Just as astronomy was a failure until they brought causation into play. So there's another perspective to look at that same disparate impact thing on.
Well, and so to the causality, certainly if there are rules which outright discriminate, which let's say in high schools today, those have largely been eliminated. All students are free to join any group. You can't discriminate against any group in trying to enter, a class, a club, anything like that. Now, there may be other reasons in addition to, those barriers, that certain groups aren't drawn towards certain things. That would require explanation. But the assumption is if it's not equally balanced, the only explanation is racism or sexism, etc. And if that seems irrational, it really goes back to the Marxist idea in which Karl Marx argued that every class is going to have its own logic, and they're going to use their own logic to maintain their own power in society. And thus, the dominant members of society are going to force their logic on others. You, of course, are supposed to fight back on this, but if you don't, the only explanation is because you have embedded a false consciousness of your oppressor. And therefore, you don't even see, You are not woke. You have not peeled back, your eyes to see what's going on. And a lot of with what we've got going on today has simply replaced that idea of class with race. And thus, the administration of a school, even if you don't have rules on the books that discriminate, it's that you're a member of the skin color or ethnicity that you are by definition carrying out policies that are going to favor your group. So you have the elimination of the idea of an individual, or the idea that a male would care about females or a white person would care about minority students, etc.
Yeah, it's good. Good point. It's neo-Marxism, a development of that idea. So if people don't know that, it's recommended, I'd recommend that you learn a little bit more about Karl Marx, what happened historically. And he's got some roots to him. So behind Marx was, in the sense of philosophic underlying what led to him, was Hegel and Immanuel Kant. And behind them was Plato.
Hegel's a good point. Hegel's main idea is that there is this narrative arc in history that is destined to complete itself. And it advances, as he said, by a thesis, an antithesis, the opposite of that thesis, and then finally a synthesis. And so we often see this in American politics, in which we elect a Republican as a president, and then we get sick of him and we elect a Democrat, and then we get sick of him or her, and so on. and that this arc then is going to complete itself, but for the reactionaries that are stopping it. And this is why you become irrelevant as a person, is because this arc is going to complete itself if we can just get rid of these people standing in our way, right? Then we will somehow all be enlightened. It will all, government will fade away and we'll just all live in harmony.
And people will go to extreme measures to do that. And we should not think it can happen here. It can't happen here. It can't. We are humans. We're not better than the people in Cambodia, the people in China, the people in Russia, essentially. We are humans like them. We have the same human nature, the same ability for greatness or horror.
And so he called the people that would be advancing this arc the world historical people. And so you mentioned the term neo-Marxism. A lot of people say that's not a term. Well, it kind of is. The young Hegelians, right, were the utopian version of this. And how hard is it to believe that you are the world historical people, right? This is what Hitler was able to sell, right? The whole Aryan idea, or the Soviets, the new Soviet man, or any hate group, right? Our people are the correct people. It's these other people who are holding us back. That's the easiest sell in the world, is to convince somebody that the reason you're downtrodden is not because of your lack of effort or whatever. It's because these other people are holding us back.
Mm-hmm. And the extent to which people will go, in case you didn't know, people can look up. I'll try to put some links in the show notes too to kind of help out. But look up Cambodia in the 70s, the Khmer Rouge. So there you had French, from what I remember, if I remember right, if I've learned right, they had French trained intellectuals, people who went to college, probably some PhDs. They come back to Cambodia to institute Marxism and communism. Okay, so we want these bad people eliminated so human progress can go forward. We need to get this synthesis going. We need to go from thesis and antithesis to synthesis. We need this conflict resolved. So let's make it happen. So people were buried alive. Not just people, millions of people. If you were a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, Scott and I would be in this group, we'd be buried alive. If you wore glasses, I'd hit that one too. Even if you're a laborer and you wear glasses, then you've got some of the bourgeois influence on you, and that needs to be eliminated from human society. So you're buried alive. In China, they had the Great Leap Forward. Most everyone was pushed out of the cities, or millions of people onto the farms, because you want to get away from the corrupting influence of the cities, which is like bourgeois, the rich. Get more proletarian, be a worker, stop the thinking so much, work on the farms. Millions of people starved to death. Same kind of thing happened in communist Russia. That is what happens. Or we know in Nazi Germany, they have the concentration camps, and they want to start a war to take over because they want resources and they think they should rule.
And all of those societies eliminate the idea of you as the individual. You, the individual, are to serve the state. You are a cell on the body politic. And as long as you're serving the state well, so be it. But if not, then you become cancerous and you must be excised and gotten rid of. And so we see the same thing with race then, is people then being viewed as a member of their group, and not just their group, their historical group. And thus you inherit the guilt of anything your ancestors did. And this gets very close to blood libel, right? That you are, you're incurable, right? You are who you are and you're an historical oppressor. And you're saying this to a 16-year-old kid, mm-hmm. Who
younger.
Yeah, who hasn't really had the opportunity to do much oppressing.
Or what?
And
Like
so,
some of these letters, it sounds like, what their daughters might be in like ninth or 10th grade. So what does that make them like 13, 14?
yeah, 14, 15,
That
yeah.
they're like inflicting this stuff on?
And so now we hear, the new buzzword now instead of equality is equity. And so there's universities are creating new departments on
Let me
top of
see. One
previous departments.
one thing
Uh,
about before we get into that a little bit about the Marx and Hegel, let me like finish off that if we could. Then equity. One thing I wanted to say, make sure people are a little clear on it in case they're not. Some already know, some don't. We know different things, but so one thing, okay, Plato came up with wrote the Republic. That was basically a blueprint for a totalitarian government that influenced the monarchs of Europe, the Nazis, the communists, um, pretty much explicitly influenced them. Not just, oh, maybe kind of sort of backhanded way, but there was that too. But um, the idea for total control is in there. So Hegel, yeah, we got the thesis, antithesis thing. And remember, that doesn't always come out really nicely. There's got to be a conflict to come for them to kind of resolve. Now, Immanuel Kant had the idea that Marx got and developed. And so we got this idea in communism, and he got this idea of Kant about how K-A-N-T, how consciousness determines what you see. And so for Marx, it was economic forces determine your consciousness. And so there'd be a proletariat and a bourgeois. Proletariat, the poor, the worker. Bourgeois, the rich, the intellectual. The proletariat, Marx decided, were the ones that really provided value and carried society forward on their backs. The bourgeois thinking was irrelevant. It was a parasite. So there he shows that reason, he's saying implicitly, is irrelevant to human life. It's a parasite. But the bourgeois had a certain view of the world from the economic forces, and they could not communicate with the proletariat. They were experienced entirely different worlds that did not overlap, that were in conflict. And the bourgeois had to be eliminated for human society to go forward. That comes from Kant. And also, in a different way, the Nazis got that view too, but the way they looked at it was the Nazis were superior and everybody else was inferior. So the Jews were the inferior group, other people were the inferior group, just like the bourgeois for Marx. For the Nazis, it was the Aryans, whereas for Marx, it was the proletariat. You got these groups that cannot really communicate with each other. So the German intellectuals would think that German science and English science is fundamentally different. They cannot really communicate or understand each other. It's not really possible. So therefore, reason's out. The only thing left is to fight for, and look at what they did. So
Let me jump in right there. You make a good point about things being particular to time and era and people. The German Historical School in Economics argued just that economic principles are unique and deterministic to that time and period, and there are no universal economic laws. Demand curves slope downward, right? There are some things that are pretty universal in economics, certainly not everything. But we're seeing that same thing then being played out with race, that your logic is particular to your race and to your gender, right? And your heteronormativity, et cetera. And you couldn't possibly understand somebody else's lived experience. And while it's important to hear each other's lived experiences, they're not everything, right? Logic still does exist.
yeah, there's a fundamental underlying identity in all humans. We have a human nature. There's not human natures. There is the human nature. And there are many variations on that theme. There's a principle, and there's many varying measurements of that principle. And one other thing too, so in case people think, well, yeah, again, still, it's like all that horror there, it'll never happen here. Okay, well, what was Germany like before Nazi Germany? What, in the 1890s, Scott, wasn't it a rich, flowering period with a lot of like great literature and great science?
Mm-hmm.
People wouldn't have predicted that that brutality would happen. There was some kind of philosophical corruption being put into play in like the 30s, 20s that led to it, that unfortunately got prevalence instead of being pushed down out of the culture. But there was a very big flowering period in the arts and science in Germany before then. And, you know, China's always been known to have some great things in it, but how much came out during like the communist period? You know, what was it like before and after? Not that their society was perfect and couldn't be improved in some ways, good in some ways, not in others, but compared to what it was in the communist period, I'm sure people would have wanted to be back. A lot more flourishing. So we got to look at principles, not just appearances. But there's a little bit about Kant, Hegel, Marx to see the relevance of it. You could apply it to nowadays. You know, so you got some of this. And even people got to look at the idea of racism in people's heads. Racism, the idea 100 years ago, would be different than nowadays because now it's been so infected and corrupted by Kantian thought and Marxist thought. So, yeah, people might have been racist before, but it would have been thought of differently. But now, some people think it's a white thing you wouldn't understand. It's a black thing you wouldn't understand. It's an Asian thing you wouldn't understand. So it's basically Marxist and Kantian, and these different racist groups can't communicate to each other. But that's basically what the Nazis were saying too. Our race is better than your race.
And the whole idea that we can't understand each other, is there anything more fascinating than finding out a cultural tradition or something that seems odd to you, right? And a friend from a different group explains it and then you get it. You may not have lived it, but you're like, oh yeah, okay, I can see that. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's what makes it fun to interact with other, humans that are not like us.
Or we can empathize and we can exactly 100% identify in some ways with cats and dogs and turtles and birds. With them, they're not human, so in every way, no. But in some ways, yes, there's like 100% identification that we're living animals. We understand in some ways each other. But if what they're saying is true, then that would pertain even more to animals. We couldn't understand animals. Why the hell would we have them as pets and get along? Why are we such good friends with like dogs and cats? It's like ludicrous, obviously. But things like that, they don't want you to think about. People get so caught up in this anger and emotion and hate. They try to like funnel you into this stuff instead of thinking about this group, this race, and this race. Well, what about people in general and dogs? We get along with dogs. This race gets along with dogs. This race gets along with dogs. Like, look at the broader picture and see the cause-effect relationships going on. It's not just a matter of like math and statistics. There's this identity we have with each other, and we can get some understanding, and we do. And I think people from different races form perfectly happy, deep, understanding marriages with each other or friendships. It's a fact.
Well, and we see that if you look at the past 40 years worth of data, interracial marriages increasing. Pew Research actually has polls going back to the 1950s on if a black person moved next door to you, would you move, or would that bother you, or what percent of? And we've seen those numbers going dramatically down. And the vast majority of people these days don't care about that stuff.
Yeah, good. Good. All right, so you were going to bring up that other point. I just wanted to make sure I discussed the Marx, Hegel, Kant, Plato thing a little bit so people could see what they thought, how those principles are relevant to what's going on today, how they're not irrelevant.
Well, yeah, so let me bring in another name, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher and literary critic, argued a couple of things: that hierarchies of power are oppressive. Now, they certainly can be, right? If you look through human history, that's certainly the case with slavery, or with, the 3% owning 90% of the land before the French Revolution and so on. But this is also kind of merging together with that Marxist idea that you've got a class logic, or, a race logic, because Foucault argued that knowledge and truth are culturally contingent. They're a function of the power of that group. And while, again, that can be the case, it is not always the case. Hierarchies often exist out or emerge out of competence, right? Some people are better at on the basketball team, right? The captains tend to be the better players, and so on. But if we have that idea, then, that hierarchies of power are contingent upon time and race, etc., then we somehow have to undo that. We can't just say we're going to treat people equally. So we now slide into this term equity. And equity is about adjusting the shares of who has what. Now, if a student is using a wheelchair, well, then of course that student is going to get some additional equity. We could say they're going to get an elevator pass, whereas other students might not. And it's easy to start with an example like that. But this idea then slides into, right, Kurt Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron, where all things should be equal. You see classes now, advanced classes, are being eliminated at some schools because they don't have either the right racial balance, or it's somehow unfair that these kids are getting arguably better teachers or more resources. And, the long run implication of that as a society, if we're going to start, why not eliminate varsity athletics? Let's all just be junior varsity. Get rid of advanced courses, right? You're going to eventually drag everything down to the lowest common denominator.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that's fundamentally irrational in there, saying hierarchies are oppressive, is dishonest, context dropping, illogical, shows no understanding of human nature, whatever. Humans, like it or not, are social animals. There's no way to have a social animal without having some kind of hierarchy. The issue is not getting rid of hierarchy and everyone being the same, which is impossible. The issue is doing the social structure and the hierarchy correct. We are self-sovereign social animals. Other animals are social too. Every social animal has different hierarchies for different things. It's going to happen.
If hierarchies exist and emerge for a reason, they provide structure for a tribe, a team, whatever, then the question is, are they fair? Do they have open access? Right? For AP or advanced classes, honors classes, it used to take a teacher's signature, typically from your last teacher of that subject, science or social studies. And the general rule of thumb was B or better, right? And then you would be recommended for the advanced class. Well, that's gone. Teachers have no say. If you want to be in an advanced class, all you have to do is tell your counselor, and you're in it. So the access to that hierarchy is wide open. Now, we could argue, should we leave that kid in there if they're struggling? And I think we do that too often. We wouldn't do that in sports. Throw some beginner kid on varsity and say,
no way.
Yeah.
Or put someone in the NFL. I want to be in the NFL. Like, I wouldn't be, man. I'd be killed. I get brain damage. No way in hell.
And the military and sports are other pretty good examples. And certainly there was racism there, right, with blacks not being allowed to be quarterbacks. Um, but really, as more money got into the game, the more money that's on the line, the less you can afford to be racist.
Yeah, and you
And the
can
same
find that
with
explicitly in some conversations sometimes, looking at different people in baseball and football, how that's actually been an issue. But then sometimes the good thing is they find out, whoa, you're actually human and I actually like you. And that actually came up. What's that movie? Um, there's a cop, a black cop, who's in a racist southern town in the heat of the night. That's a movie I recommend to people. Good movie made in maybe the 60s. I'll put that in the show notes. Um, but go ahead.
Well, the military, again, despite obvious abuses of race, in the 30s, 40s, and after, is one of the most meritocratic societies around, that they care a lot about competence, and they don't care what you look like. They don't care if you're from the South or from the North.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. But
and someone might be saying, yes, but they discriminate against gays or they discriminate against this. Yes, again, back to that original question, compared to what? Compared to a perfect world where we all are wonderfully equal, or compared to every other societal institution?
in the societies around the world through history, what have some of them been like? There's some societies you wouldn't want to live in today.
And that framework is not to dismiss the abuses that still go on, but is to recognize how much progress has come. But you can't almost ever talk about progress, because that somehow gets interpreted as you don't think there's more work to do. Well,
Yeah.
of course there's more work to do, but we should also acknowledge, again, talk to your grandparents about what life was like, compared to how we have it in any of these areas, from race, sex, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing that's a big issue in this today, a fundamental underlying thing. Um, the ability or lack of the ability of some people to reason and be logical. We need a lot more rational conceptual thought and logic to get this under control and to really
Well, and
get rid of racism.
the argument is that logic is a tool of,
Yeah,
Western
oppression.
white oppression and so on, and that you're using that to secure the power and the hierarchies of your group, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, so hopefully the way you put it, that way people can see how that's kind of like what Marx might say. Some things are, there's tools of oppression of the poor. And so you got some that same idea today with like the abomination of claiming that logic is a tool of oppression. Logic being the art and science of connecting our concepts and propositions to reality. So basically, folks, yeah, they're saying that being true to reality in your conceptual thinking is a tool of oppression. Being honest, being real, being committed to reality is a tool of oppression. And that's like obviously an evil thing to say on its face. And then the thing you say about some things being contingent on time, people need to, or people could learn how to really look at that. Again, some philosophy is important there. We got to really be careful in listening to what some people say and not interpreting it the way we want it to be. We need more asking and not telling. We need to like tell people. We need to not tell people what they mean, but we need to ask. Contingent on time. Some things are obviously like if I was born 50 years earlier, then I would have been different than I am now. different influences, would have known different people, different schooling, so on and so forth. There'd be some differences. I'd still be human. But what Scott is talking about is not kind of accidental or temporary or some superficial stuff, but a fundamental. So John Dewey is one who's an influence on that. So the idea here is, as Heraclitus said, you can never step into the same river twice. So there is no permanence. Everything is change. So Dewey was even so corrupt. He said, and so like ludicrous, he said, Aristotle's logic has worked for so long that it cannot be true anymore. That's what they are talking about. There are no principles. There are no universals. There is nothing timeless. Everything is socially contingent on what you want. It's what the society decides on. Fundamentally, human nature, any belief, everything, the nature of reality. This is entirely different than some equally valid, some like valid things about, yeah, how would I be if I was born 100 years earlier? That would be contingent on time. I would wear different clothes. I would speak a little different. If I was born in a different place, I would eat different food, speak a different language. Yeah. But according to Dewey, reality would be in that society. We would, like now versus 10,000 years ago, there would not be anything causally, really, that connects us. No principles, no timeless truths, nothing. That's very different, as I say, than being born at one time versus another. So when that, what's her name, Foucault or whatever, is talking about that, that's what she means. That kind of on principle saying that no principles can exist. Which is kind of ludicrous in itself. You know, she's saying the world is a certain way at all times, in all places, timelessly. This is a universal principle. That everything changes. There's a contradiction right there. But it takes more a little philosophical astuteness to grasp that. I mean, I never would have when I was younger. But having more experience with that, having studied philosophy, having seen that kind of thing again and again, I've gotten better at it. Not that I'm perfect, but I can catch those things way better than I used to. But, Scott?
Yes.
What other points would you like to make?
Well, I would just to follow up on that. That's one of the points of postmodernism is the idea that there is no truth, no one truth, I should say, is maybe a better way to say it, which is a fair enough point, that there are different viewpoints in arguably societies or cultures that have had power, have kind of viewed and framed the world that way. Fair enough criticism. The followers, though, have taken some of these ideas to the extreme such that there is no truths at all, right? Well, that would eliminate physics, right, or certain fields. So that's probably taking it too far.
But let me go in really quickly. That's a contradiction in itself. It's like, there are no truths. Well, is that true? Is that a universal truth?
Yeah.
Well, if that's true, then there are truths, and then the whole game's over.
But this is precisely what leads back then to the lived experience. There are no truths except for the truth that I've lived, and then who are you to tell me what my truth is? Which now really leads to who asserts their arguments the most forcefully. And this is why you see so much yelling on college campuses, is they are asserting their truth. And if you're not taking it and acknowledging it, then more of that's going to come out. And so we're turning into a nation that just yells at each other about whose lived experience is more correct.
Instead of talking and getting along and communicating and learning, getting things done. Yeah.
And that's why it also so easily slides into violence.
Yeah, I was about to say. Right. the proletariat wanting to express their learned experience under the influence of Marx, the Aryans wanting to express their lived experience, trying to tell the world that they should listen to their lived experience. Yeah. Any other points there on the paper, in your notes you want to flesh out, bring up? Cool. So it should be clear by now, but for the record, Scott, are you a racist?
No. And the whole anti-racism movement makes a good point that people should look at these things and be aware. And if there are things we can repeal that are holding people back from exercising their liberty, who's not for that? Like, welcome to being a libertarian.
True.
Let's remove things that are holding people back.
Or the idea to be self-reflective. It's like, wait, think. But yeah, when you say you are racist because of your skin color, no, that's fundamentally evil. If you say, hey, think about it, let's be reflective on ourselves, in the culture, make ourselves better. I'm for self-improvement, making the culture better, but not for this making morality into something metaphysical. Morality is morality. It is chosen. It is not metaphysical. Metaphysics is different. People have a human nature. We have choice. Later on, morality comes into play. But to put morality at a metaphysical level and say, you are fundamentally evil, you are fundamentally good, is wrong. Good and evil are chosen and developed in our character, as Martin Luther King Jr. and others have pointed out.
And if you want people on your side, telling them they're horrible and evil is probably not the way to get more people on your side.
Or at least not good people, not the kind you want.
Right. And really, who's protecting power hierarchies now?
Yeah.
That if you've got to demean other people in order to get your view as to be the only acceptable view. I was taught in college that reasonable people could disagree on things. And that's a pretty good guiding principle.
Yeah, it's Animal Farm. People could read Animal Farm if they want to, and they can see how the same thing applies. And literally it's, well, they can just read it. But, and so you like people of all races, Scott? As long as they're good? Yeah. And
I like good people.
And you want to...
this is the thing about people being good or being moral or having talent. It's not distributed to one group. It's spread across all of humanity.
Yeah.
And so, yes, arguably, if we get structural things out of the way, people are going to be a lot freer. But are we going to eliminate advanced classes because that somehow is going to help kids who are struggling in math? I don't think that's the answer.
Yeah. Give me more Bruce Lees. Give me more Frederick Douglasses. Give me more Abraham Lincolns. Give me more... what was the ancient Greek physician? The... what oath? Oh, the Hippocrates. Give me more Hippocrates. Runners from Africa, we have a lot to learn from. From Mexico, the Kalahari in Mexico. And dang, now I forgot. Earlier, when I was talking to a student, I remembered the ones in Africa and forgot the ones in Mexico. Now I'm doing the reverse. Racist. The Kalahari! The Kalahari, yeah. There, the Kalahari in Africa and others. Yeah. Learn a lot from different people, and we need to be promoting the good in them and not trying to separate and divide. But cool. So, not good in American education, something we need to get rid of. Not good for student psychology, not good for our future. Our children deserve better. We want to get rid of racism by celebrating the achievements of people, not by trying to make morality metaphysical and by making people hate each other. Any last words, Scott?
Amen, brother.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, Scott. Much appreciated. Appreciate the wisdom. Truth to power, man. Truth to power.
All right.
All right. You have a good day. And thanks, folks, for listening. And we will talk with you all soon.